All right, guys. So this one could be big. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about my new theory on retention. Now, this is a relatively old idea, except the way it was explained to me before all of this was that it was just not scientifically sound. Now, I actually have some evidence for its efficacy. But before I get into it, check out Leviathan Wellness at Amazon and leviathansubs.com for our stimulant-free pre-workout, sex enhancers virility and fortitude, our testosterone booster vitality, safeguard and shield for nerve and soft tissue support. Essentially, we're trying to cover all the bases with PE before we branch out into more mainstream items. But if you're looking for ways to keep yourself safe or improve PE efficacy, check out leviathansubs.com. Then Peak Male Physique for affordable penis enlargement equipment. In there, you can also find my book, BD's Big Book of Length and Girth Expansion Pack. Essentially, it is my Reddit and YouTube's body of work condensed into a easy to follow format. So if you're struggling to follow along or getting confused with me always double taking, then my books are for you. Expect a major update for free coming out this May. Now back to the actual talking point, retention theory. So it will also be more apparent why I am standing after the fact. Let's get to the premise. Assuming the tunica is a fascia, or at least behaves similarly to a fascia. For those who are uninitiated, the fascias of our body are basically the connective tissue casing surrounding our muscles and organs, and that's what gives us support yet flexibility. If the main connective tissue body, the tunica in our penis, is also there to provide support for function, then we can assume that the tunica is some sort of fascia, and the same laws that work with fascias apply to the tunica. And therefore, if we can manipulate the tunica like we manipulate fascia in physiotherapy, we found the keys to penis enlargement. So what we know as of right now is that when under load, the fascias do stress relaxation, same with the tunica. Then we know that hypertrophy happens to fascia and connective tissues when put under strain. Strain is when they're stretched. So if we stretch the tunica, it will get longer over time as it adapts to that stressor. And then finally, this has been the missing piece, is something called fascial plasticity. And that is the fascia's propensity to take the shape that it was originally in. So this is what gives like structure to your body. And essentially it is the adaptation for constant movement patterns. So if you always have poor posture, hunched over like this is why it hurts to go up like this, because one, those muscles are weak. Two, that fascia is super tight in this hunched over position. So if we work on manipulating the fascia, we can get better posture. Then we'll talk more about how that applies to PE here in a bit. Now, as I already said, hypertrophy happens to help maintain load better. So if we're constantly saying hanging 5 pounds off our penis, eventually our penis is going to get exceptionally good at hanging 5 pounds of tension. And part of that growth response, well, I guess it is a growth response, part of that response is bigger, thicker, longer collagen fibrils in the tunica. But since the tunica is likely to retake its original shape, what we're doing is making the original shape bigger. So yes, we will see some length gains and some girth gains, but we're not going to see dramatic changes in the desired shape that we want. So if we're going for length, since we're going back to our flaccid state for 99% of the day, we are not going to be able to keep that length. And this is where retention theory really starts to make sense. Essentially, we're already forcing growth with our current routines. But if we add in a bit of retention to keep the shape after the fact, so in a way, we are still forcing gains, but we are not forcing the desired direction. For some hard gainers, particularly growers, they're going to have a very difficult time translating stretched flaccid length to erect length on the ruler, just because it is not trained to take that shape. So this is where the idea of retention comes in. All we're doing is staying the shape that we want to be by the end of penis enlargement. So if we're trying to get longer, we're going to try to stay longer as long as possible. Now, this doesn't have to be done erect. We'll touch base on a few protocols later on in the video. This is not supposed to be fatiguing. All the fatiguing work is going to be based off my interval protocol. So interval pumping, interval length protocol. That's what's actually causing the growth factor. All we're really doing is convincing the tissues to take this new shape instead of rebuilding stronger in the old shape. Now, this is also not healing in an elongated state, and that's why I'm changing the name here. One, because I'm a narcissist and I want to make sure I get credit for this. And two, the way it was explained to me is that essentially that constant tension causes mitosis. And what we know now about the tunica albuginea is about 80% protein. Proteins, collagen, do not have an active self-repair response. That is all mediated by the stem cells in the penis. So saying that we're pulling apart with traction causes mitosis is not the case. And this is why I originally written off the idea of like long-term extension wear. But what's really happening is that those current fibrils will be trained to take the longer or thicker shape, the wider shape. And then the new fibrils that we are creating are going to be layered into this new longer or thicker shape. Healing is done around the clock. What retention is doing is changing the heal pattern. So I don't think this needs to be done all day. In fact, I discourage it because if you're having slight compression and slight blockage of fresh nutrients or blood to the penis, we're going to be seeing less nutrient uptake. Therefore, we'll potentially see slower gains if we're always in an elongated state, and we could potentially see scarification since that tissue is not getting ample nutrient supply. So that's why I'm basically saying for girth right now, you don't want to do it for more than 60 minutes at a time. And for length, you don't want to do it for more than 6 hours at a time. Ideally 2 to 6 hours for length retention. Just so you guys know, I'm not pulling this out of my ass. Let's talk about some medical evidence and some physiotherapy evidence. So first, the Achilles tendon elongation surgery. Essentially, if you've had, let's say, poor development and your Achilles is constantly shortened, or it was caused to be shortened by genetic defect, your calves will never activate. Therefore, you're always walking on your tiptoes. Not very good for, healthy movement patterns. What they do to correct this is make a Z-shape cut into the Achilles, leaving space for the collagen fibrils to fill in as it heals. The important thing here, though, is that they make the Achilles set in an elongated state. So they've either put you in a cast or a boot or a splint to keep your foot completely at a 90-degree angle. So that way the tendon becomes the correct length at rest. So that healing in an elongated state is what's causing the correction of the too short Achilles tendon. Without this splint, the tissue will have the propensity to revert back to its original shape, therefore completely defeating the purpose of the surgery. Now, more of my wheelhouse with physiotherapy, we're talking about fascioplasticity. This idea is what's responsible for poor flexibility, poor movement patterns, and poor posture in individuals. Essentially, the connective tissues, the body's fascia, become accustomed to a certain movement pattern. So if you're constantly hunched over, like I already said, you're going to see that pattern of the connective tissue start to take shape. Then you can see this a lot in like repetitive strain injuries. For example, when I played a shit ton of basketball, my right shoulder was much higher than my left shoulder because I was constantly doing this. And my shoulder eventually stuck up, not like this, obviously, but it was higher. And then after a couple years, particularly with a lot more stretching and flexibility training, they're much more even. But it still happens with just weird stuff in general. It doesn't just have to be posture. It's kind of like a repetitive strain injury, except the injury aspect is more or less because it's taught to be in that shape rather than it being broken down from constant wear and tear. Now, this does also increase, chances of injury when you're too tight and you're trying to do stuff outside the normal movement pattern, but that's beyond the scope of this video and penis enlargement in general. So if we're trying to correct for these poor movement patterns and poor posture, we basically need to teach the fascia to relax, and we need to teach the muscles the correct movement patterns so that way the fascia does not get accustomed to being in that shape again. Now, if you have more severe cases of fascia tightness, you'll have to go to a massage specialist to help loosen that fascia. Then you do the physiotherapy aspects of the flexibility training and the strength training to, remediate the issue. But essentially, this is the main idea of sports therapy, is breaking down a whole bunch of this tight fascia to help rebuild these correct movement patterns. Now, how does this correlate to PE? As many of you know, Perv at Massive Novelties, think that the tunica is a form of fascia because at the end of the day, in the broadest sense, the tunica is a connective collisionist structure that holds nerves. That is exactly what the fascia is. So we can safely assume that the fascia makes up the tunica, or the tunica is a type of fascia. That's a better way to put it. Now, personally, I think the tunica, since it is so much stronger than fascia, has a bit more in common with tendons. But at the end of the day, research shows tendons, ligaments, and connective tissue fascia all behave very similar under load. Now, when we look at myofascia, the stuff that's going to be fixed with, posture training, that stuff is always under some form of load. So, your muscles are always relatively about the same size. So if you're training your fascia, it is going to retain the shape of your muscles. And if your muscles are getting bigger, your fascia is going to get stretched. With penis enlargement, we are not at full size 99% of the time. So it's very easy to see how this tissue will not retain its new shape if it's not in that new shape to begin with, especially if we think the tunica has some sort of shape memory. Now, again, I do think you can gain without this retention stuff. I've gained at least 2.5 inches without doing this retention training. Now, to be clear, we do gain size and tissue density with the current routines. What I'm arguing is with a bit of retention, we can coax that tissue to take the shape that we want. And that's really what we want at the end of the day, because we don't really want thicker, denser tunicas. We want longer and wider tunicas to make for bigger erections. You can gain without this. I just think with a bit of direction, we can get a lot more done in a shorter amount of time. Then for hard gainers, so let's say some growers that really struggle putting on length, this is probably going to be the key to unlock your gains, because this is what's going to train your tunica to actually be in this longer state. All right, so let's go over some retention protocols. Essentially, we need to stay in the shape that we want from anywhere from 60 minutes to 6 hours, depending on how safe it is. So let's start with length, because that is probably what most people want to start with anyway. But the easiest way to start is with sleeves. So after your session, put a sleeve on that is the length of your non-bone pressed erect shaft. Then your glands are going to stick out the tip and you won't have anything riding up on the base. This is going to train at least your flaccid to stay in this shape. This will also allow you to urinate easily. Now, this is best for out of the house. I was talking to Perv. He says he thinks that uncut guys need to wear a vacuum bell to keep it all, I guess, neat and tidy. I wouldn't know, but let's see. But after trying with a vacuum bell myself, I get much better retention. So that length sticks around more just because there's a little bit of a vacuum pressure keeping my glands from being retracted back into the sleeve. This should be done for 2 to 6 hours. Start with 2 hours and then slowly work your way up, just because we're really just trying to avoid lack of blood flow. That being said, if you're like trying to train your grower to be more of a shower, the longer you wear it, the better. This one's pretty safe to do, even with the vacuum cup on. Just don't have a very significant vacuum. But there's another thing with this. If you're using the vacuum cup, you can develop some pretty fucking big glands. So it could be a good trade-off or side effect. Then a traditional all-day stretcher is another good option for this. So like the Phallus and Forte, if you were a sucker and bought one at retail price, or what I call the El Cheapo, the Size Master Pro, you can find those on eBay, AliExpress, and maybe eventually Peak Male Physique, we'll have to see. But essentially it's a leg strap that goes on your leg and that holds your length. We do not want any tension. We just want to keep the length that we had from our workout session, our actual fatiguing sets. Then we have light hanging. This is going to be less than a pound or 500 grams, which is roughly a pound. This is going to be very hard to wear out of the house. Also, something to keep in mind that the bouncing from walking can also generate fatigue. That's something we're trying to avoid, so don't make sure it's not too heavy. It's going to really be dependent on how thick you are with how much weight you want to use. Then, this is a more experimental one, a sleeve plus a cock ring after 10 minutes of interval pumping. And essentially what we're doing is we're teaching that expansion to press up and out, up towards the glands, stretching out the length, so that internal pressure builds up that way instead of that way. So this will also cut down on lymphatic issues, since a common practice for cosmetic surgery is compression, which keeps the swell down after surgery. That compression is going to keep any lymph buildup from getting stuck in the lymph channels. But since we are using a cock ring, you don't want to do this for more than 30 to 60 minutes at a time. Now for girth, it's very simple. You just want to wear a cock ring post pumping. Now this forces more internal expansion and this does cause more edema, but this also forces the tunica to bow out, and that's what's really going to cause the girth gains, is that stretching this way. And because we're training it to take a wider shape, it will be wider over time. Now this can also lead to some very natural and very large temporary girth gains, but basically if it gets to the point where it aches, you want to take off the ring. This also will have potential lymphatic issues. Since we're blocking the drainage of lymph channels, that stuff can kind of get gummy and stick in your lymph channels, causing something called lymphoseals. They're relatively benign, but they can build up over time if you're not careful. So if you've had one before, don't do this method. It's not supposed to be overly tight. This is not clamping. We are just trying to train your flaccid to be fatter and more distended. Your erections should subside, and this will definitely cause some temporary discoloration, so make sure you do fire goat rolls after each time you wear a cock ring post session. And again, people with lymphatic issues, stay away from this method. So with all these, we want to make sure that we still have sensation. Essentially, if we have a lack of sensation, that means our body is kind of getting numbed out to this whole thing, and it's pretty stressed out. Additionally, if we're cutting off blood supply, it's a good sign that the nerves are not liking it. So every 30 to 60 minutes, make sure you can still feel your glands upon touching. It will be a little bit cold, but it should not be like deathly cold. It should not be like well below body average temperature, nor should it be numb. Now, another way to think about this is that if we're trying to be bigger often, we want to do PE more often, so we might want to just split our routines into an AM session and a PM session, maybe even an afternoon session for those people that are lucky enough to work at home. But we need to be very careful of overwork. So the best way to really make sure you're not overworking is just making sure your erection quality is not tanking. We can overcome overtraining with Cialis and other aphrodisiacs. Those aphrodisiacs you can get at Leviathan Wellness. And I've talked about them before on my Golden Path, what I'm doing for the maximum penis enlargement gains. That's a series here on this channel. Retention on rest days. Now, this is probably the bigger change. I used to think you don't want to do anything on your rest days, but this shows that you probably want to do just a little bit to make sure that shape is retained. So Light pumping and then a cock ring right after is okay, but we do not want this to be fatiguing. So about 80% of your typical working pressure. And then an all-day stretcher with no strain is okay. Sleeves are okay. Lightweight hanging is okay. Basically, the protocols that I already laid out are going to be your best bet for retaining on your rest days. You got to be careful though with the cock ring because that can cause distal expansion, which can be fatiguing over time, especially if you get erect often while wearing that cock ring. So just keep that in mind. Now, a bit out of left field, ejaculation might lead to less results, and this is solely because there is a retractile response after ejaculation that makes it harder for your penis to get erect. If we're constantly trying to get as big as possible to, retain this shape, ejaculating frequently is going to make it very hard to be as big as possible. So edging is encouraged because, you're training that erection to be that big all the time. And then sex is encouraged because you're not going to get the same arousal response as you would with pornography or masturbation alone. But excessive masturbation, more than once a day, is discouraged. The too long didn't read is that the more often a tissue takes its shape, the more likely it is to be in that shape long term. So if we keep our penis elongated for 2 to 6 hours after length or 30 to 60 minutes after girth, we will see better gains overall. The more often we do penis enlargement during the day, the more likely we are to have this shape. But the problem is that we might run into overwork. That wraps it up for this video. That was a lot. I can already tell you this is going to be at least a 20-minute video. We'll find out in post. So, this took a lot of work. If you want to support me, like and subscribe to this channel. You can check out Leviathan Wellness Supplements. They're very good. Just check out our reviews. Then you can also get equipment at Peak Male Physique or my books, which will teach you everything I know about penis enlargement from a physiotherapy standpoint with this next major update in May that you will get for free. So, might be worth your while. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll have more content for you soon.